Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take the source material you provided, distill the most potent insights, and give you the intellectual shortcut you need to be truly well-informed. Today, we are tackling, well, probably the single quietest, most powerful shadow that falls across every single human life, the reality of death.
It really is the ultimate deep dive, isn't it? Because it forces us to confront not just the fact of our end, but what that finitude means for the quality and, the very nature of our time here, how we choose to spend it.
Exactly. Our mission today is pretty profound. We're unpacking the extensive sources you shared on the fear of death, and we're exploring whether this deep-seated anxiety is simply a fundamental biological instinct,
Yeah.
maybe a philosophical mistake that can be corrected with logic.
Or, and I think this is the most interesting part, perhaps it's the most powerful catalyst we have for shaping a truly meaningful and authentic life.
Right. The aim here is transformative. We want to move beyond that familiar, often paralyzing terror, that visceral anxiety that can surface in the middle of the night when you really think about non-existence.
And turn it into something clearer, something practical, something we can actually apply to our daily choices, our relationships, and frankly, our planning.
The sources open beautifully on this point. They acknowledge that death sits quietly at the edge of every life. We are experts in denial, aren't we? We fill our days with work, screens, noise, future planning.
Anything to keep the thought at bay.
But inevitably, sometimes after a difficult hospital visit or maybe when a friend passes, the thought just appears with this crystalline clarity: I am going to die.
Mm-hmm. And then the next thought follows immediately. Knowing that, how do I live with it now?
And that confrontation, it leads directly to this core split that the material identifies. On the one hand, you have people who immediately find comfort in, a kind of calm, almost spiritual acceptance.
The circle of life perspective. Death is the natural conclusion.
Exactly. But for so many others, it triggers intense, paralyzing terror. A terror rooted not in one single thing, but in this chaotic mix of non-existence, physical pain, maybe potential judgment, or the profound sadness of separation from everyone and everything you love.
So that sets our core question for this entire deep dive.
Should we fear death? And if that fear is, to some extent, inevitable just because we're human, what can we transform that emotional energy into? How do we use it rather than being, ruled by it?
And this is the critical analytical starting point from your material. Before we can even answer if we should fear it, we have to recognize that fear of death is not a single monolithic emotion. It's not one thing.
It's a spectrum.
It's a spectrum, a complex bouquet of distinct, often conflicting anxieties. And if we can't name the specific anxiety we're feeling, we can't apply the right philosophical tool to manage it.
Okay, let's unpack this because this is where the sources get immediately useful. It transforms this abstract dread into a manageable list. The idea is if you can put a name to the fear, you can start to dismantle the paralyzing power it holds.
You can start to work with it. The sources outline 5 very specific forms this anxiety takes, and psychologically and practically, they're worlds apart.
It's true. And I think one of the biggest psychological traps is feeling all 5 at the same time.
Yes, that's what results in that overwhelming, non-specific dread. Separating them is the first step toward clarity.
So let's start with the first category. This is arguably the most tangible one, the one we are biologically hardwired to avoid: the fear of the process.
Right. And to be clear, this is not the fear of being dead, that state of absence, but the intensely physical fear of the act of dying.
This is rooted in biology, isn't it? And our need for dignity and autonomy. We're talking about really concrete anxieties here.
Very concrete. Intense physical pain, suffering. The indignity of losing control over your own body. Losing bladder or bowel control, for instance.
And the medical side of it: invasive, sometimes futile medical procedures, being attached to machines, or becoming completely dependent on others for your most basic needs.
The sources highlight that this fear is almost universally rational. It is correct and necessary to want to avoid unnecessary suffering. So when people say, I fear death, very often what they're actually describing is a justifiable fear of physical degeneration and the loss of control that can come with modern, medicalized dying.
That's a crucial distinction. And it's also the only fear on this list that can be, well, largely mitigated by proactive planning.
Absolutely. But then we jump from that intensely physical and practical fear to the utterly abstract with the second category, the fear of non-existence.
The void.
The void, the anxiety that I, this integrated self, this consciousness that perceives the world, will simply cease to be.
The ultimate blank. The sources describe this as a kind of cognitive failure loop. Your conscious self, which has been the inescapable center of your universe since you gained awareness, is trying to contemplate a state where that consciousness is utterly absent.
Where the lights are permanently out.
It's impossible for the mind to grasp non-experience. You can intellectualize it, of course, but the deep primal impulse is just to continue.
And this inability to successfully imagine one's own absence is often what results in that profound existential unease, that panicky sense of erasure. It is, in a way, the most difficult philosophical mountain to climb because it attacks the very foundation of your identity.
And that terror of erasure, that's what leads into the third major anxiety,
Oh.
the one that shifts the focus entirely from the self to external accountability,
Yeah.
the fear of what might come after.
This one, of course, is heavily steeped in belief systems and the unknown. This is where anxieties about judgment emerge.
And great audit.
Exactly. The concern over whether your life was good enough, facing potential spiritual consequences, punishment, or perhaps just the anxiety of an unknown transition, facing a divine power.
The crucial distinction here, as the material points out, is that this fear depends entirely on faith. For a strictly secular person, this fear is, well, it's irrelevant.
But for a person of faith, this fear, the fear of the audit, can be a far greater driver of behavior than the fear of the void. It's an anxiety that operates not on biological survival, but on ethical and spiritual performance.
And that leads naturally to the fourth category, which the sources call the non-selfish fear.
The fear of leaving others behind. Separation anxiety.
This fear is so unique because it's a direct consequence of love, isn't it?
Completely. It's the pain of causing profound grief to the people you love. It's the concern about leaving dependents, children, partners, elderly parents unsupported, or simply the heartbreak of knowing you'll miss their future growth, their key life moments.
This is often the most potent fear for people with strong family bonds. It basically says, I'm not afraid for my eventual state, but I am terrified of the disruption and suffering my absence will inflict on them.
It's an altruistic fear, but it can be devastating. The ultimate separation anxiety, really driven by relational responsibility.
And finally, the fifth fear. The sources identify this one as perhaps the most useful and actionable of them all. The fear of an unlived life, or simply regret.
This is that internal cold realization that you might look back on your final days and think, I wasted my time.
Or that you failed to become the person you truly wish to be because you allowed fear or distraction or denial to run your life.
That regret is the anxiety of being judged by yourself, by the person you know you could have been. It's the failure of self-actualization, and its shadow extends backward through all the missed opportunities and postponed commitments.
So we have the fear of suffering, which is the process, the fear of erasure, non-existence, the fear of accountability, judgment, the fear of pain caused to others, separation, and the fear of wasted time, regret.
That is an incredibly complex stack of worries we carry around.
It really is.
And this framework is essential because when we ask, should we fear death, the analytical lens has to be applied to each point. Which of these 5 fears are rational, based on necessary facts about pain or loss?
And which are based on philosophical or emotional misunderstandings that we can maybe intellectually address.
And most importantly, which of them can be channeled into immediate positive action and wisdom right now? That is the path from terror to purpose.
Okay, so let's start trying to address them. Let's tackle the biggest intellectual hurdle first, that fear of non-existence, with one of the most classic philosophical arguments designed to provide comfort.
Ah, yes. The argument famously articulated by Epicurus. This often serves as the intellectual foundation for many secular views on mortality.
The famous philosophical consul.
It is, and it's a pure application of logic, designed specifically to dissolve the terror of the void. Its power lies in its elegant simplicity. It aims to detach the experience of life from the non-experience of death.
The core thought process, as it's laid out in the source material, it hinges on a simple fact. You, the conscious subject, will never, under any circumstance, experience being dead.
The logic is rigorous. It goes like this. While you are alive, death is necessarily not present because the state of being alive is its inverse.
Okay, that makes sense.
Once death arrives, you are no longer a subject capable of consciousness, sensation, experience, or suffering. And since suffering requires a subject, and in death, there is no subject.
There can be no suffering in death.
Precisely. The conclusion is clinical, almost antiseptic. You will never, ever experience your own absence. It's a state of non-experience, and therefore it is nothing to you. The sources quote the key phrase, which is the cornerstone of the argument. When we exist, death is not. When death exists, we are not.
They're mutually exclusive states.
Mutually exclusive. And Epicurus reinforces this with what's often called the symmetry argument, which the sources detail extensively.
The symmetry
And
argument.
the argument asks, if we are logically terrified of the infinite time after our death, why are we not equally terrified of the infinite time before our birth?
That's such a fascinating parallel. That was an endless expanse of non-existence where I was not present. No conscious subject was there to miss the sunrise or feel pain or worry about the future.
And you felt absolutely no deprivation during that time. You weren't bothered by it at all.
So logically, if the time before birth held no terror, the time after death should hold none either. Because in neither state are you a conscious subject capable of suffering deprivation or boredom.
It suggests our fear is based on a simple temporal asymmetry. We dread what is coming, but we never dread what has already been.
So from this philosophical perspective, the fear of non-existence is rendered an intellectual illusion. The mind is trying to imagine a state it is incapable of occupying. It's a cognitive error.
Like trying to feel hungry for a meal you ate last week. Yes.
If you accept this conclusion, the entire focus shifts, doesn't it?
It has to. Stop worrying about the aftermath. There is no after for the self to worry about. Non-existence, by definition, cannot inflict harm because there will be no us left to be hurt. The suffering only occurs while we are alive, worrying about a state that, by its nature, precludes suffering. It's an incredibly powerful psychological lever.
It is powerful. And for those who value logic above all else, I can see how it would be profoundly comforting. But I want to push back a bit here based on the material. This sounds so neat and tidy, but why does this logic so often just bounce right off the emotional core of so many people?
Yes.
The logic holds, but the stomach still clenches. Why does the argument fail to completely soothe us?
And that's where the sources bring in the counterargument. It's often associated with more modern philosophers, and it accepts the premise of Epicurus, but challenges the conclusion that death is nothing to us. This view, the deprivation argument, is key to understanding our emotional attachment.
The deprivation argument. Okay, unpack that for us.
It argues that Epicurus is correct, that the dead person cannot suffer the loss. But the fear experienced by the living person is rational because death deprives us of all the future experiences, relationships, achievements, and pleasures that life might have offered.
Ah, so the tragedy of death isn't the suffering of the state itself.
It's the loss of goods. The fear is not that I will be miserable while dead, but that I will be deprived of all the incredible potential and experiences I might have had while living.
So it's grief for an unfulfilled future, felt right now, in the present.
Exactly. We are not just rational beings. We are beings defined by memory, anticipation, and deep attachment to being a self. The philosophical console helps reduce the intellectual terror by proving non-existence is harmless, but it often fails to quell the sorrow over the cessation of all potential.
The emotional reality of attachment, that simple fact of being and valuing that being, it trumps the pure logic of non-experience.
It often does. So the argument is invaluable because it proves the void isn't a source of pain, but we still have to wrestle with the emotional reality that we value our consciousness and the potential that comes with it.
We can acknowledge the logic, but that deep primal attachment to existence still demands attention. The battle against this fear is internal then, managing the emotional attachment with rational logic.
That's a great way to put it.
Let's pivot now. If the philosophical console only partially solves the problem of the void, we need to explore other frameworks where death isn't just an end, but maybe a transition or a fundamental condition of meaning. The sources shift now to religious and existential views, where fear takes on entirely different forms.
Yes, and when death is viewed as a gateway, as a passage into another state, the primary focus immediately shifts from the fear of nothing to the fear of something else, something possibly immense, sacred, or ultimately accountable.
Okay, so let's start with the religious view. In traditions where the soul persists, where the self continues beyond the physical body, the fear of non-existence is largely replaced by the fear of judgment.
Right. This is the anxiety over whether one's life has been lived according to divine law and the prospect of facing eternal consequences for one's actions, both good and bad.
And that fear of accountability can be a powerful moral engine, far surpassing the social contract or secular ethics. I mean, if you truly believe your actions have eternal weight, your ethical compass shifts instantly.
It does. However, the sources emphasize that this isn't meant to be raw, paralyzing terror. It's meant to be tempered by a distinct emotion the material calls sacred awe.
Sacred awe. That's a beautiful distinction. What exactly is the psychological difference between raw panic and sacred awe when you're facing the immense reality of the divine?
It's the difference between dread and humility. Sacred awe is born from the recognition of vastness, the sense of the infinite scale of reality, and your own profound smallness within it.
So it's a deep seriousness and reverence rather than panic.
Exactly. It demands humility and serious conduct. When a person feels awe, they are humbled, but they're often also inspired to rise to the occasion of that vast reality.
So the fear here is constructive. It's part of a dual system. On one hand, you have this positive fear, the constructive kind rooted in justice, which motivates you to live justly, compassionately, and humbly.
It acts as an internal moral regulator. It ensures the individual doesn't drift towards selfish or harmful behavior,
Fear is guidance, not as imprisonment.
unnecessary tension. But the source material is quick to point out that paralyzing terror is almost universally discouraged in mature religious traditions. And why is that? It's because these belief systems usually contain mechanisms to soften that intense anxiety over our inevitable human imperfection.
And that mechanism is usually trust in divine mercy, forgiveness, and compassion.
Precisely. That is the critical counterbalance. The hope of grace or mercy acts as the emotional release valve, mitigating the intense fear of punishment. The equation is balanced. The fear motivates you to live a good life out of responsibility, but the hope of mercy keeps you from being consumed by anxiety over your inevitable mistakes.
So the ideal stance then, in this view, it isn't indifference to death, nor is it raw terror. It's this complex, dynamic mixture of responsibility for your earthly actions, profound hope for the transition, and trust in the divine process.
It provides an immediate structure for meaning, but it swaps the existential terror of the void for the performance anxiety of the audit.
Now let's move back to a secular, yet intensely focused philosophy that uses the awareness of death not for judgment, but for self-discovery. The existentialist view.
Right. And this perspective views the awareness of mortality as absolutely fundamental to defining human existence.
The sources state this so succinctly. They say existentialists suggest that fear of death is not a defect or a philosophical mistake. It is simply part of being fully awake and radically honest about our condition.
It's the sound of reality checking in, demanding our attention.
And this knowledge that we will die is the ultimate constraint. It instantly strips away the illusion of endless time, and it exposes human fragility, forcing us to confront the most urgent question possible.
Which is,
Given that my time is finite and I am free to choose, how should I live right now?
and this is where the perspective connects fear directly to authenticity. The existentialists argue that the true problem isn't the feeling of trembling itself. The trembling is honest, it's necessary, but rather allowing that fear to push us into denial, distraction, or what they call bad faith.
And denial, it allows us to postpone important choices indefinitely. We act as if we have infinite tomorrows, so we never fully commit to our core values today.
We live inauthentically, we follow societal scripts, or we wait for permission to be ourselves.
So awareness of death is the ultimate constraint that defines our radical freedom. By facing death honestly, we stop postponing what truly matters. We're forced to take responsibility for every choice we make because time is finite, and there are no cosmic second chances for this specific life.
And this ties directly back to one of the 5 fears we mapped out earlier, the fear of regret or the unlived life. For the existentialist, this fear is the ultimate productive anxiety.
It's the fear that if I don't act now, I will have squandered my freedom.
Exactly. If you believe you have endless time, you can always say, I'll start living authentically next week. But when death is brought into stark focus, that becomes a lie. The only time you have to commit to your values, to express your love, to create your meaning, is this moment.
That awareness acts like a high contrast filter. Everything that is petty or inauthentic or distraction just recedes into the background when you juxtapose it against the reality of finitude.
And you're left with only the important choices, starkly visible. The challenge is immense, which is why the trembling before death remains. The goal isn't to eliminate the trembling, but to use that deep existential awareness as a source of clarity rather than a source of paralysis.
But doesn't that place an immense burden on the individual? I mean, the expectation to live so authentically, to make every single decision count, that can itself be a source of anxiety. What do the sources say about managing that pressure?
They definitely acknowledge the weight. The pressure is the price of freedom. The material suggests that authenticity doesn't mean perfect heroism. It means facing the reality of our limits and choosing our path with consciousness.
So the focus is less on achieving greatness and more on ensuring that the life we do live, however flawed, is truly our own.
And not a life inherited from others or dictated by denial. The fear clarifies priorities by demonstrating what isn't important.
Let's ground this analysis now and circle back to the central question of rationality. Is the fear of death rational? We have to synthesize what we've learned by clearly distinguishing between the fear of the process and the fear of the ultimate state. This is really the practical core of the deep dive.
I agree. We can confidently separate the fields that require practical planning and action from the fields that primarily require a philosophical reframing.
So let's start with the fear of pain and the process.
As we established, this fear is entirely rational. It is correct and necessary to fear unnecessary suffering, confusion, and loss of control. This isn't a flaw in our wiring. It's a necessary component of our survival instinct.
And the beauty of this specific rational fear is that it is not useless. It's highly actionable. It compels us toward practical wisdom now.
Exactly. This fear drives us to plan. It means having honest, difficult, but necessary conversations with loved ones and medical providers about advanced directives.
What treatment you want, and maybe more importantly, what treatment you absolutely do not want.
Right. It compels us to explore palliative care options that prioritize dignity and comfort over aggressive, futile intervention. The fear of a bad death doesn't paralyze us. It compels us to organize our affairs, document our wishes, and communicate them clearly.
While we are still in full control of our autonomy, it's a proactive fear that actually increases control, paradoxically, in anticipation of losing it.
Well said.
Now, let's return to the philosophical conundrum. The fear of non-existence. We have the clean logic of Epicurus, that non-existence is not experienced, and the emotional counterargument of deprivation, that the fear is rooted in the current loss of future goods. Where do the sources land on the ultimate rationality of this fear?
They land on a balanced synthesis that I think is profoundly clarifying. Rationally, the fear of non-existence, as a state of being dead, is irrational.
Because the subject of consciousness that could experience fear or deprivation is gone.
Right. The philosophical console holds, you will not suffer.
But, and this is the important caveat, the material stresses that the fear of losing the experience of life remains profoundly understandable. It is rational to grieve the loss of all future possibilities. The current living self is the one experiencing the agony of anticipation.
The wisdom here is to manage the two aspects. We can acknowledge the intellectual truth that death is harmless to the dead, while simultaneously acknowledging the deep human sorrow that comes from our attachment to being alive.
So the power of this knowledge is that it allows us to shift focus. Since we cannot mitigate the state of being dead, we must focus intensely on the quality of the state of being alive.
It seems the goal here is to transform that fear of the void from a paralyzing terror into a source of bittersweet urgency. The fear doesn't disappear, but its utility shifts.
It becomes a reason to be intensely present. Since the future is finite, the present becomes infinite in its meaning.
Beautifully put.
Okay, let's shift to the final and often most crushing fear, the fear of separation. This one seems impossible to neutralize with logic because it's born from the very things that make life worth living, love and connection.
This is the fear that even the most hardened Stoic struggles with, because it arises not from self-interest, but from empathy and relational commitment. The fear is entirely about the impact on the other.
The grief of your loved ones, the guilt of leaving them without necessary emotional or financial support,
Or the crushing certainty of losing the chance to guide them through life, to see your children grow up.
Given that we cannot eliminate the grief of those we leave behind, what action does this specific fear compel us toward?
The source material is very clear on this. Because this fear arises from love, it is the most powerful teacher of immediate action. It urges us to prioritize relationships now, ensuring that love, appreciation, and important family stories are communicated without delay.
It compels us to use every interaction as if it might be the last.
It means we must put our emotional affairs in order. We must not delay saying, I love you, or I forgive you, or thank you.
It transforms into an urgency to create an emotional legacy.
Absolutely. This might mean documenting family history, writing letters to be read in the future, establishing a clear framework of values to pass on, or structuring resources to ensure loved ones are cared for. We cannot remove all sorrow from death, but we can prepare the hearts of those around us with honesty, love, and immense presence while we are still here. This fear, paradoxically, makes us better, more present people.
We've covered 5 distinct fears and explored how philosophical logic, religious hope, and existential commitment address them. Now we arrive at the ultimate question, the capstone of this deep dive. What is the goal? Is total paralyzing fearlessness achievable, or is it even desirable?
The sources address this by acknowledging the inspirational ideal, the image of the saint or the sage who accepts death calmly. However, the material adopts a gentle, grounded view, suggesting that for most humans, some level of deep emotional response, a trembling, remains.
So a life utterly devoid of any fear of death might even be inhuman.
It might, as it would imply an absence of the survival instinct and a radical detachment from all love and attachment.
So if total fearlessness is unrealistic or undesirable, the key must be transformation, not elimination. We have to channel the energy of fear away from paralysis and into clarity.
Correct. The goal is to transform that paralyzing terror into three specific, powerful virtues. First, honest awareness of our limits. Second, profound gratitude for the present moment. And third, a radical courage aligned with our core values.
We move from a life imprisoned by denial to one defined by clear-eyed, courageous acceptance.
And this framework leads directly to a potent, uncomfortable, but essential practice that is echoed across history, found in Stoicism, early Christianity, and Eastern traditions alike. The practice of remembering death.
Memento mori.
Memento mori, which translates simply as, remember that you must die. And it sounds morbid, doesn't it? Counterintuitive to purposefully dwell on the source of your anxiety.
Why would we want to regularly think about the one thing that causes so much dread?
The sources explain that the fear of death, when it's kept in the dark, it becomes this generalized, shapeless anxiety that infects all our decisions. But when we look at it directly, it becomes a sharp, non-negotiable boundary condition that forces us to prioritize.
The key is that it's practiced, not obsessively, but often enough to maintain perspective.
Exactly. Historically, the Stoics used this practice to focus on virtue and control what they could, their actions, while ignoring what they couldn't, which was the future. Early Christians used it to focus on salvation and humble conduct, but the consistent outcome across different traditions is the same: clarity.
So let's talk about the concrete, day-to-day psychological benefits of this deliberate awareness. How does regularly confronting finitude change my Tuesday afternoon?
When we maintain this perspective, several things happen simultaneously. First, small annoyances lose their power. If you're stuck in traffic and you realize that your finite lifespan is ticking away, the urgency of being annoyed by minor external obstacles just evaporates.
You realize the time spent raging is time wasted. The trivialities shrink to their correct size.
Exactly. Secondly, gratitude for simple, everyday things increases exponentially. Every breath, every sunrise, every conversation with a friend suddenly becomes a gift with a definitive expiration date. When you know the party will end, you pay more attention to the music and the company.
And thirdly, we become incredibly careful about how we spend our time. If I have a finite number of weeks, I will naturally move away from distraction, endless scrolling, petty gossip, meaningless works, and toward meaningful action aligned with my deepest values.
And finally, and perhaps most importantly for our relationships, grudges and petty conflicts diminish. Holding on to anger seems like an enormous waste of a finite, precious resource.
Love and forgiveness become not just moral ideals, but urgent practical necessities.
The time spent estranged is simply too valuable to sacrifice to ego.
So in this framework, death stops being solely a source of terror and truly becomes the ultimate teacher of what matters. The entire line of questioning shifts. We stop being ruled by the shadow of death.
It shifts profoundly. It moves from that initial paralyzing query, should we fear death, to the far more productive question, how can awareness of death help us live more fully, truthfully, and kindly while we are here, right now, today? That awareness is the tool for authenticity and prioritization.
That brings us to our final synthesis and the balanced answer for you, the listener. It is complex, encompassing biology, philosophy, and emotion, but the sources provide a remarkably clear guide.
We can conclude that some fear is absolutely natural and, unavoidable. The instinct to survive is built into every living organism. Fear of physical pain, loss of autonomy, and the terrible pain of separation from loved ones are deeply human and justifiable fears.
But the sources also clearly delineate that certain fears can be profoundly reduced by understanding. The fear of non-existence, for instance, can be eased by internalizing that there is no you left to suffer the state of being dead.
And fears of extreme judgment can be tempered by religious concepts of mercy and compassion, provided one holds those beliefs.
Ultimately, the transformation of this deep human anxiety is key. Instead of allowing the reality of death to push us into denial, we can use that necessary acceptance, that feeling of trembling, to push us toward a life defined by purpose, deep love, and total presence.
The goal is not to feel nothing. The goal is to not be ruled by fear. We can acknowledge the trembling while still consistently making courageous, meaningful choices based on our values. We choose action over paralysis.
We probably cannot and maybe should not erase all fear of death. It is tied to our deepest capacity for love and our will to live.
But we must refuse to let it make our lives smaller, more timid, or distracted. The wisest stance, according to everything we've reviewed, is to look death directly in the eye, admit the fear, and still choose to live honestly, kindly, and awake, knowing the clock is running and every moment is precious.
And here is the provocative thought for you to take away from this deep dive. If the fear of an unlived life, the fear of profound regret, is one of the most powerful and actionable anxieties identified in the source material, then the single most courageous act you can perform today is not to try to stop fearing death.
But to sharpen your commitment to what matters, to love, to justice, to beauty, to truth, and to compassion, because death is inevitable.
Use that feel of regret to fuel a life without delay. Go live the life you'd be proud to look back on.